the notion of catastrophic. Mhm. Hello. How do climate alarmists and their lapdog media friends respond when a veteran climatologist who challenges the notion of catastrophic anthropogenic global warming gets appointed to a high post in the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration? Stick with us, and you'll find out on tonight's From the Stacks. Welcome to From the Stacks, named for the fact that I, at least, am among the stacks, the librarian's term for bookcases, that line several rooms of my house. Tonight, we have two great guests on to discuss the climate change alarmist industry's full-bore attack on Dr. David Legates, a veteran climate scientist who has taught climatology and related courses at the University of Delaware for many years. Why attack him? Well, because he's just been appointed Deputy Assistant Secretary of Commerce for Environmental Observation and Prediction, a role he's exceptionally well qualified to fill. And here's the rub, he's one of the world's foremost scientific critics of the idea that human-induced climate change will, if not stopped, be so catastrophic as to justify spending hundreds of trillions of dollars to try to slow it down. The climate alarmists' response is part and parcel of a widespread effort to use fighting climate change to justify massive changes in your life, my life, the life of everyone around the globe, giving governments and increasingly global government increasing power over the choices of how to live, what to do, where and how to travel, and essentially everything else we do, because everything we do uses energy. That's why I'm eager to send a free copy of the documentary video, It's Easy Being Green When You Have No Choice, Sustainable Development and the End of History, as my way of saying thank you for a 100% tax-deductible donation to the Cornwall Alliance. In support of our mission to educate the public and policymakers about biblical earth stewardship, economic development for the poor, and the gospel of Jesus Christ with the biblical worldview, theology, and ethics that it brings to a hurting world. To request your free copy of It's Easy Being Green, just go to www.cornwallalliance.org. That's www.cornwallalliance.org. Click on the donate button and make a gift of literally any size, doesn't matter how large or how small, and in the comments field ask for It's Easy Being Green, or simply mention promo code 2009. That's promo code 2009. That's for the year 2020 and the 9th month, September. One other quick point before we bring on our two great guests and dive into our subject for tonight. You can help us reach lots more people if you'll share this video on your Facebook page and tag them, or just share it directly onto their pages. We want to reach as many people as possible with the enlightening, liberating information we offer on From the Stacks. So please help us out that way if you can. Tonight, my co-host, Megan Kennard, isn't able to join us, and she usually tries to watch comments as they appear during the program and call them to my attention so we can address them as we go. Well, don't let that stop you from commenting, though. We'll review the comments afterward, and as much as we're able, respond to them in writing right there among the comments. Then you can return and see what we said. Now, back to tonight's subject. Dr. David Legates is an advisor and senior fellow of the Cornwall Alliance and a co-author of two of our major papers on climate change. He received his PhD in climatology from the University of Delaware, and he has taught at Louisiana State University, the University of Oklahoma, and the University of Virginia before now teaching at Delaware. He's been research scientist at the Southern Regional Climate Center, chief research scientist at the Center for Computational Geosciences, and visiting research scientist at the National Climate Data Center. Dr. Legates has published more than 125 times in refereed journals, conference proceedings, and monograph series, and he's made more than 250 professional presentations. His research has appeared in such peer-reviewed journals as the International Journal of Climatology, the Professional Geographer, Journal of Geophysical Research, Journal of Environmental Hydrology, Journal of Climate, Climate Change, Bulletin of the American Meteor. Oh, well, so many more. Won't go through all of them, but it's an amazing list. In short, David Legates is a climate scientist's climate scientist. Nonetheless, when the Trump administration last week announced that he had been appointed Deputy Assistant Secretary of Commerce for Environmental Observation and Prediction, climate alarmists around America went ballistic, and the mainstream media sang their tune without question. Tonight, we're going to discuss some examples of their reactions to Dr. Legates' appointment. I try to have Dr. Legates himself on the program with us, but ethics rules within the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, henceforward NOAA, by the way, prevented that. So instead, we have, in keeping with the advice of Proverbs 27:2, let another praise you and not your own mouth, we have two great guests scheduled to be on tonight, men who know David and his work well, and who also know the climate controversy inside out. One, a climate scientist himself, the other, the director for environment and energy at a well-known Washington think tank. First, let me introduce to you Myron Ebell, a lifelong lover of nature and defender of the environment and director of the Center for Energy and the Environment at the Competitive Enterprise Institute. Myron, this is your first time on From the Stacks. Thanks very much for coming. Tell us quickly a bit about the Competitive Enterprise Institute, what you all do, where people can find you on the internet, and particularly about your own work and your background that brought you into this.
Thanks for having me, Cal. It's great to see you. I just want to applaud the work that you and the Cornwall Alliance have done over the years. It's great to have you as an ally in the battle for sound science, for anti-climate hysteria, and we could go way down the list on a whole host of environmental topics that you're an expert on.
Indeed.
Your group has just done great work, so I just want to start with that. CEI is a free market public policy institute that believes in less government and particularly in less regulation. We think that a lot of the ills of our society are that we just have regulatory overload. It's suffocating people's freedom and economic activity. So our Center for Energy and Environment is one of our programs. We have several others. We work with the Cornwall Alliance and a number of other groups to promote sound policies on the environment and pro-energy policies. We oppose all energy rationing policies. And we've been skeptical of the so-called climate consensus for a long time. And so we've kind of been at the center of things here in Washington, D.C. It's not so apparent that we're at the center of things in the United States, but of course everybody in Washington thinks that they're the center of the universe. So if I thought that, I would think I'm much more important than I am.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Really appreciate your joining us. Jim, our producer, do we have Neil Frank online with us yet? Apparently not. Well, then we will move on without Neil.
We are working on
it. Must be happening. Okay, all right. Well,
the gremlins
wonderful technology, right?
Yeah.
Wonderful technology. Well, the first media report on Dr. Legates' appointment was by National Public Radio on Saturday, and it was under the headline, "Longtime Climate Science Denier Hired at NOAA." That report got republished at many local public radio stations. Indeed, by noon Monday, a search for that exact title turned up 56,200 results. Other media followed suit with similar headlines. Energy and Environment News' Climate Wire had climate denialist given senior role in science agency. And Science, the flagship journal of the National Association for the Advancement of Science, reprinted that under the title Climate Change Denialist, given top role at major US science agency. The Daily Beast used Climate Change Denier hired for top job at NOAA, and The Week used an almost identical headline. The Washington Post's headline, kind of surprisingly enough, was actually a little bit less pejorative than that, Myron. They said, NOAA taps David Legates, professor who questions the seriousness and severity of global warming, for top role. Now, Myron, you have been watching the climate change debates for a long time. You've watched the scientific aspects, the political aspects, and so on. What do you make of those headlines? Why do these media outlets call Dr. Legates, who himself has a long and distinguished career as a climatologist, complete with plenty of peer-reviewed publications, a climate change denialist, a climate science denier, indeed a climate denialist, or a science denier? I know you're familiar with David's work. Is any of that true?
Well, he sounds like a pretty bad guy, doesn't he? Of course, I've known David for a long time and worked with him and watched him and learned from him. And I've had him speak at events that I put on Capitol Hill. I've listened to him testify. I've used him as counsel on various issues where I've asked him, hey, David, what does this really mean? He's a really great guy, and I believe he's a very fine scientist. And I'm not a scientist, but my colleague, Pat Michaels, who is another climate realist scientist at CEI here, I asked Pat about David, and he said, well, you ought to check him out on Google Scholar. He's got over 12,000 scholarly citations of his articles. This puts him in the first rank of climate scientists. He's very unassuming and modest, but this is I think the reason the media reaction, to get to that, which was your question, the media is part of the so-called climate consensus. I would call it the climate herd. They all run in the same direction. There's never any people saying, hey, wait a minute, hey, maybe we ought to think about this, or is this really true? And so they got their marching orders pretty quickly, and they've come out with all guns firing, and so have the climate consensus scientists, the alarmists. The thugs have already been out calling him names, and I think you're going to talk about that later probably. So David can't defend himself. So I'm glad, Cal, that you and the Cornwall Alliance are out here showing that he's not the monster that he's been immediately portrayed as. For people who've never met him and have never read any of his work and have no idea what a good scientist he is.
Yeah, thanks, Myron. I'm hoping that we will have Dr. Neil Frank on with us shortly. He is a climate scientist, former director of the National Hurricane Center, and I'd like him to kind of tangle with the scientific aspects of that.
Yeah.
But you've been following particularly, Myron, environmental and federal agency politics inside Washington for many years. And can you help us understand just why this kind of discussion devolves into that sort of attack on the person, rather than just sticking with talking about, the evidence, the stuff that science is really supposed to be about? Why does that happen so quickly and easily, especially in Washington, D.C., which, as you mentioned, is the center of the universe, and all the best and brightest of the world are there, right?
Well, of course, it doesn't happen on the climate realist side or the climate skeptic side. We're all willing to engage in debate, and if you hear some growls, it's one of my two dogs. Look, this debate has become a political pushing and shoving match, not a scientific debate. And the climate scientists who are part of the alarmist team uh, they may be doing science off on the side, but they're engaged in the political debate as political actors. They will not engage with people who disagree with them. They will not debate. They call every reputable climate scientist a kook or a denier or something worse. Uh, and of course, name calling is what you resort to when you don't have the evidence and the facts on your side. And that's where we are in the debate. They think that because they control the media, they control the universities, they control all the great institutions, that they can silence people like David Legates and like you and like me who disagree with the supposed scientific consensus. And so this is all it's all politics, and it's all dirty, and it's low, and it's disgraceful what's already happened to David. And wait till
Yeah.
tomorrow and next week and next month, because it's only going to get worse.
Yeah. I'd love to leave the politics behind. Unfortunately, we can't really quite do that
Yes,
immediately,
yes.
because one of the themes that appeared again and again in some of these reports was that Legates's appointment would politicize NOAA, an agency whose work should be objectively scientific. The Washington Post,
Mhm.
for instance, described NOAA as, quote, until now, unfettered by political influence. But then it said, Legates's appointment raises, quote, concerns in the science community that this could be a White House orchestrated move to influence the agency's scientific reports, unquote. In fact, it led its report by saying, critics fear move could threaten the scientific integrity of one of the country's foremost climate research agencies, unquote. Myron, has politics never ever influenced NOAA in the past? And does Dr. Legates' arrival at NOAA augur more politicization? You've been around there for a long, long time. What have you seen?
Well, first of all, the administration is political, and it's run by the president, who was elected through a political process. And so, the amount of San, stop it. The amount of politicization at in any federal agency, waxes and wanes. And I think in many ways people say, "Oh, it's politics," but in fact, the real threat to our system of limited government and our civil liberties is that there isn't enough politics, and that there's too much influence by the career civil servants. And
Hmm.
I could give some examples of that, but let me just say, uh, you know, I run a coalition called the Cooler Heads Coalition. I'm the chairman of it, and it's a bunch of nonprofit groups that question global warming alarmism and oppose energy rationing policies. It's been around for a long time. Uh,
Great
Back in
group.
the
I've been
Clinton
glad to attend a few
administration,
times.
yes, exactly. An extremely valuable participant in our meetings and everything else that we do. But the Cooler Heads Coalition puts on briefings on Capitol Hill. And before I became chairman of it, but when it was a brand new organization back in the late 1990s, uh, I noticed that there would be people who'd come from the administrations, the Bush administration, no, I'm sorry, the Clinton administration, and say, I'm sorry, I'm so glad you're doing this, because as a federal civil servant, if I say anything, the Clinton administration will come down on me with a ton of bricks. I can't dissent from their agenda. And I remember Dr. Will Happer at Princeton University, in the Bush administration. He was, I think actually yes, in the Bush administration, he was the chief of research at the Department of Energy. He's a very
Hmm.
distinguished atmospheric scientist, and he testified on Capitol Hill before Congress early in uh, the Clinton Gore administration,
Hmm.
and uh, he was fired because he didn't give the answer that Al Gore said that the administration had to have on climate issues. So there's a lot of politicization going around, and NOAA has been the subject of, I would say, political propagandists. It's been controlled by political propagandists for a long time, and I'm glad that after
But the
3.5 years,
didn't the Obama
yes.
administration clean that up?
Now it got worse, but it's not just the politics. It's the career civil servants are political actors. They're political propagandists,
Hmm.
and so it's taken 3.5 years for the Trump administration to say, "Hey, we've got all these great energy policies. Maybe we now ought to turn our attention and do something about the junk science being put out by NOAA, the National Oceanic
Yeah.
and Atmospheric Administration, and NASA." And so
Hmm.
I'm hopeful that this is just the first of a number of moves that will do something to limit and limit the damage done by junk science that's being promoted at these two massive agencies.
That would be wonderful. Well, I see that we now have Dr. Neil Frank on with
Oh,
us.
good.
Neil, welcome. Let me just introduce you to our audience a little bit. You have been with us once before, but I'm sure there are folks who were not with us then. Dr. Neil Frank is the longest serving director of the National Hurricane Center, serving there from 1974 to 1986, then serving as chief meteorologist for CBS affiliate KHOU Houston until his retirement in, what was it, Neil, 2007, I think. But though you're retired, you still keep up with research on hurricanes and on climate in general. And Dr. Frank has become an outspoken defender of climate realism, the view that human activity surely contributes, but not a great deal, to climate change, and that the net effect of increased carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is beneficial to humanity and all the rest of life on Earth because it improves plant growth everywhere while not raising temperatures enough to pose a problem we can't solve. Dr. Neil Frank, thank you so much for coming back with us here on From the Stacks.
Well, I'm sorry that I'm a little bit late. For some reason, I read your letter that it was 6:45 my time. I apologize.
Oops. Okay, well, thanks much for rejoining us. Um, uh, Neil, we've talked about a few things here already that you might have been expecting. Now, before we go on to some other things, let me just ask you about your own experience of the the threat of the politicization of science in government scientific agencies. As the longest serving director of the National Hurricane Center, a federal agency whose scientific work forecasting hurricane tracks and intensities is vital to public health and safety. When you were there from 1974 to 1986, 12 years, were you ever pressured to tailor your scientific reports to particular political priorities? And if you were, what did you do if that happened?
Well, it's interesting, Cal, that I was there when NOAA was formed. I joined the National Hurricane Center permanently in 1961. And if I remember, NOAA was established in 1970. I think this is the 50th
Hmm.
year of the anniversary of NOAA. So I was there when it was formed. And of course, within the NOAA organization, we have the National Weather Service, and my office at the National Hurricane Center was an office within the National Weather Service. So I was an
Okay.
employee of NOAA from 1970 until I left in 1987. Now, in terms of political pressure, no, I didn't have any political pressure on me at that time. But keep in mind that I didn't get very vocal about global warming until basically the mid 80s. Dr. Bill
Mm.
Gray was the instrument that caused me to go back and take a hard look at what was happening in terms of global warming. So I was not involved in the
Mm.
controversy during most of my career there as the director of the National Hurricane Center. However, I can tell you that if I was there today, there would be tremendous pressure from NOAA, the headquarters, to line up with the alarmist
Mm.
position on global warming.
All right. Thanks a lot. Hey, everybody. I just want to take a quick minute to remind you that through the month of September, the Cornwall Alliance will send you a free copy of the DVD documentary, It's Easy Being Green When You Have No Choice: Sustainable Development and the End of History, as our thanks for a 100% tax deductible donation of literally any size. All you have to do to request your copy is to go to cornwallalliance.org, click on the donate button, make your donation of any amount, and in the comments field, ask for It's Easy Being Green, or just mention promo code 2009. Cornwall Alliance needs your support to continue our work, so please do be sure to do that today. Now, back to Dr. Frank. Neil, the media have
Yeah.
been reporting since mid-July that this Atlantic hurricane season was going to be more active than most. Indeed, that it could be historic. By late July, there were 8 named storms, which was at that point a record for that period of the season. A few weeks ago, you were on this program and you explained that 2 to possibly as many as 4 of those storms wouldn't even have been named as hurricanes prior to, or even tropical storms, prior to the development of new criteria for naming storms. And if you took those out, the result was that the season, as it had developed to then, wasn't really unusual at all. Now, as of now, here we are, September 15, there have been 21 named storms. How many of those would you say, and I know that you keep up with these, it's kind of a hobby for you as well as you being one of the world's top experts in it, how many of these would you say might not have been named under previous criteria, whether in your own time as director 35 to 45 years ago, or even as little as, say, a decade ago? And has politics, particularly the politics of climate change, had anything to do with the changing of those criteria?
No, I don't think that climate change has had an impact on the people at the National Hurricane Center. What has changed is our ability to observe systems over the entire Atlantic. And that has made a big change in the way that we go ahead and name storms. Now, let me explain to you that there are 2 energy processes in the atmosphere that can develop hurricanes. The primary energy process in a hurricane is thunderstorms. You get a weather disturbance, it creates a bunch of thunderstorms. The thunderstorms heat the air, and the hot air rises. And then at the surface, we have air that circles in, and that's what we call a tropical storm or a hurricane. Now, the other energy process is the classic winter type storm where you have cold air side by side warm air. And cold air will try to ride underneath the warm air, and the greater the contrast, the stronger the winds. So in the spring and in the fall, we oftentimes have a cold front that moves into the Gulf of Mexico or off of the southeastern coast of the United States, and it weakens, but it does create thunderstorms. So now the thunderstorms begin to heat the whole thing up. So you have both energy processes taking place. The question is, do you name something as the winds begin to crease and say, well, that's more of a tropical type system than a winter storm type system? Well,
Hmm.
this year, so far, we are naming those kind of storms early. And if you take the D
Uh-huh.
storm, the E storm, the O storm, and the Chi storm, and the K, all of those develop the east coast of the United States. They begin to pick up in the winds. So the Hurricane Center named them, and the name only persisted for less than 24 hours. And then they decided, no, this is a classic winter storm. So they de emphasized or they denamed them, and then they carried on the marine warnings in a classic winter storm process. So, of those 4 storms, they might not have been named even when I was the director back in the 80s and the 90s. And another factor I think that is important is we're seeing storms all the way across to Africa. We've got a storm by the name of Vicky. I don't know; it's not very strong, but it would not have been named probably when I was the director because we didn't have the mechanism to look at storms over in that area. And it's kind of interesting that if you look back in history, 1933, we had 21 named storms. 21. Not one of them was recorded in the Eastern Atlantic, or not one of them developed in the North Atlantic. Out of that 21 storms, 17 were formed by African disturbances. Now, contrast that to today. Of the 20 or 21 named storms that we have today, only 10 of them have been by African disturbances. In other words, 10 of those storms have developed in the Atlantic or in the northern part of the Atlantic. It's questionable whether they would have been named. Certainly, they wouldn't have been named 30, 40 years ago. And so you can see how the historical record of hurricane activity gets distorted by naming those kind
Hmm.
of storms and then going back and comparing with storm activity that was 40, 50 years ago.
Yeah. So it's not so much politics there as in part sort of being driven by the change in technology that enables us to detect these things at a much earlier stage than we
Right.
once were able to do. Thank you very much,
Now,
Neil.
yeah,
Now,
Cal, let me make one
my
other comment. Now, as
okay,
far as the hurricane is centered, there is no, I don't think, political pressure to name more storms so that it will support the alarmist position that says that global warming is causing more storms. That's an entirely different political issue.
okay, all right.
Mhm.
Well, Myron, as so often happens in reporting on things like this, the media went quickly to experts they could count on for critical comments about David Legates. Not surprisingly, only one of the reports I saw quoted anyone favorable, and that report cast that person in a negative light. So
Yes, yes.
here are a couple of examples of these negative responses, both taken from NPR's report, which is the most widely published one. First off, quote, climate researchers slammed NOAA's decision to appoint Legates to a key scientific position. Quoting now from this expert, he's not just in left field, he's not even near the ballpark, says Jane Lubchenco, a professor of marine biology at Oregon State University and head of NOAA under President Barack Obama. And then here's another one. They quoted Michael Mann, professor of atmospheric science at Pennsylvania State University, says in an email to NPR that Legates has, throughout his career, quote, misrepresented the science of climate change, serving as an advocate for polluting interests as he dismisses and downplays the impacts of climate change. So, Myron, what do you think of those comments, and what can you tell us about Jane Lubchenco and Michael Mann?
Uh, Let me begin by confessing, Cal, that Jane Lubchenco and I are graduates of the same undergraduate college. But of course, we all have unfortunate associations, and she probably thinks the same if she were asked about me. Look, she may be a good scientist, but she was a political hack during the Obama administration. Some of her testimony before Congress was just embarrassing from a scientific standpoint. Um,
Well, I
and
did
so,
note,
of course,
note
she's
that
part
she
of the
is a
team. Look,
marine biologist.
yeah,
She's a
look,
marine biologist, not a climatologist or a meteorologist.
right, the climate establishment. Look, they've got their people that they trot out who are meant to be, they serve the role of thugs and hacks, and some of them may enjoy it and some of them may be embarrassed by it, but so Jane Lubchenco is not qualified to speak on the qualifications of a really distinguished climate scientist like David Legates, who, by the way, is really one of the world's leading experts in precipitation patterns and what
Yeah.
climate change does to change precipitation. As for Michael Mann, I better not say too much, but he's one of those people who's always out there with a nasty swipe and smear of somebody. Uh, and he does that from the basis of a very modest scientific background and understanding and research record. But
Yeah.
he's trotted out by the media as the world's greatest climate scientist. So as long as he enjoys the media hoopla and the attention, that's he's going to continue making these kinds of smears
Yeah.
and just repulsive comments about people. I could say some of the things he said about other people recently, except they're obscene. So I'll leave it there.
Yeah, yeah. Mann, of course, was the primary author of what came to be both famous and then infamous as the hockey stick climate
That's
change
right.
graph that essentially using tree ring paleoclimate uh, proxies wiped out the medieval warm period and the Little Ice Age to make it look as if there had been no significant change in global average temperature over the last couple of millennia. And then it was discovered that, well, that
Well, it was,
there had
Cal,
been
it was discovered
serious
that it's,
misuses of data and serious misuses of statistical methodology that made it so that you could literally have fed any random numbers into the program that they had devised and come up with a hockey stick.
right.
Go
I
ahead,
mean,
Myron.
Cal, look, the hockey stick has been exposed very clearly by people who know much better than Michael Mann as a statistical
Yes,
fabrication. Now, whether it
completely.
was intentional or just the result of statistical incompetence is still a question, and we could
Right.
have an interesting discussion about that. But the fact is that Michael Mann's career has been based on scientific research that was trumpeted by the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and but
Yeah.
was then very quickly discredited by
Yeah.
it should be said it was discredited by people who weren't part of the climate science world. It was discredited by
Yeah.
people who have tremendous statistical skills, Steve McIntyre and
Yeah.
Ross McKittrick.
Right. Yeah. Ross actually being a good friend of mine, as I know he is of
Right.
yours as well. Well, I thought it was particularly interesting that while NPR quoted Lubchenco, a marine biologist, not a meteorologist or a climatologist, neither NPR nor any of the other reports mentioned that Dr. Legates' PhD is actually in climatology, and he's taught it for years, for decades at the undergraduate and graduate levels. And that seems to me to be an intentional effort on the part of the media to downplay his credentials. Just one more bias evident in the reporting. Neil, the Week
Oh,
opined that Dr. Legates has spent years rejecting the scientific consensus that human activity is causing climate change, while E&E News's Climate Wire said similarly, Legates has spent his career denying consensus climate science while elevating the work of fringe researchers and industry funded scientists. What do you think of the appeal to consensus about climate change? And do you see Dr. Legates as far outside the consensus? If so, is that a reason for doubt or a reason for admiration or what?
well, let me say a word about David, first of all. Uh, it's amazing to me that in our modern society, that people who have outstanding credentials, academic credentials, and in terms of their business world credentials, that they have been demonized by the press. They've been demonized by the alarmists, and the alarmists have the press has picked that up, and they have demonized people like David. It's just tragedy. Judy Curry is another example. She was head of the Department of Meteorology at Georgia Tech. Joanne Simpson, who was a close friend of mine, was one of the lead scientists at NASA. When she retired, she says, I no longer have any obligation, therefore I'm a skeptic. And Fred Singer, for example, and look at his credentials and the things that he did. And I could keep going on down and down and down the list. And David fits right in with that whole group. He is an outstanding scientist. There's no question about it. And he will bring, if NOAA permits him to do so, and I'm not sure that that will happen. If NOAA permits him to do so, he will bring a tremendously needed truth to the organization. Now, in terms of consensus, this has been a tragedy down through time because there are multitudes and multitudes of people with credentials, outstanding credentials that that would question man-made global warming. Now, let's make sure that we understand. I understand. I've seen David. I've never met him personally, but I think that David's position would be very close to mine. That well, first of all, The Earth has been warming for the last 150 years as we've come out of the little ice age. That is not debatable. And certainly David would not debate that either. The question is,
Right.
what is causing that warming? And David and I and so many other extremely credible people don't believe that carbon dioxide is a major factor. Notice I said a major factor in this warming that has taken place. Now, that gets to the core of the argument. If carbon dioxide is not a major factor, then why are we trying to stymie the progress in fossil fuels or natural gas or nuclear energy? There's other alternatives. I don't have any problem with alternative energy sources, but renewable energy in terms of wind and in terms of solar is not the answer. And I agree totally with what David has said, as well as multitudes of other. This consensus of 97% is complete foolishness.
Yeah, thanks. In fact, Neil, I remember you wrote an article for the Cornwall Alliance
Right.
called What's Wrong with the Claim That 97% of Climate Scientists Agree About Global Warming. And in that article, you just basically ripped to shreds the whole notion that there was any such consensus,
Right.
let alone that it would have been, scientific to appeal to a consensus, because science is about evidence, it's about logic, it is not about counting votes.
Right.
Right. Myron, um, NPR's report included this particular complaint. Quoting here, Legates was one of the authors of a paper that questioned previous findings about the role of climate change in destroying the habitat of polar bears, unquote. Now, what's wrong with that as an objection to Legates's appointment?
Well, first of all, consensus is the enemy of science. When people stop coming up with new ideas or new arguments or new evidence or new research, then science is, we're done. We're gonna decline as a civilization. And of course, David was right. I mean, the problem that NPR has is that once one of these claims by the alarmists comes out that, oh, it's malaria or it's polar bears, or I mean, we could go down the list, but the whole polar bear hysteria has been discredited, and David, in fact, turned out to be on the right side of that debate, and that's
Yeah.
to his credit. But even if he turned out to be on the wrong side of the debate, he should get some respect because he offered real evidence, real arguments, and he was engaging in the scientific debate that's necessary for scientific progress. So right or wrong, David shouldn't be criticized. It just turns out that NPR is wrong and David's right.
Right. Okay. Uh, David actually informed me
Cal, they
by
haven't read the
email.
recent book on the polar bear. What was her name? I can't remember the girl's name.
Susan Crockford.
Oh,
Susan Crockford.
yeah,
Yeah.
Susan Crockford. Yeah, in fact, that we have a book by her available on Cornwall
Right.
Alliance's website store. That's a devastating critique of the whole notion that climate
Right.
change is driving polar bears into extinction or at least threatening them or anything like that. Their numbers have
Right.
actually more than doubled since the 1960s, and they're doing quite well. Well, David informed me by email yesterday and a bit more today that he had received numerous pieces of hate mail in his email account, and he forwarded some to me. They are frankly too profane to quote here. He also said he had received some implicit threats with wording similar to, maybe you should think about getting a gun. Well, today, and this is about an appointment of a scientist to a government position. Today, David forwarded to me a voicemail that he'd received. I think we're going to be able to play that for our viewers, and this will be a chance for you, Myron and Neil, to hear this. Is that clip ready to go?
I need to find out, indeed, do you not believe in climate is falling apart? I mean, have you looked at what's going on the West Coast? On climate change? Are you against the scientific opinion that climate change exists? I'm sorry, I am 78, I'm a multi-millionaire, or whatever that means, but I built a big company, and I know good and I know bad, and I think you're going in to head up NOAA is very, very bad. And when I decide something is very bad, I know as a citizen, I have a right to express my opinion. So you have just started to hear from you, but it's University of Delaware that I'm going to call. They have you on. You are a professor there? What kind of a university is that? And my late husband was an emeritus professor, so I know how these things work, and I know Delaware. University of Delaware ought to be ashamed of themselves. I'll get to them. Of course, we won't talk about the fact that Trump is the most disastrous. He's a murderer. He's a murderer because he said the virus would just go away when he knew all along it wouldn't. And I now think you are a murderer, so sue me. Because you are saying climate change has no role in the fact that I have a friend I just talked to in Medford, Oregon. It's killing people. It's killing people, and you don't care because you're an evil Batman. You'll hear from me more, and I can call you whatever I want. I am a citizen of this country, and you are a total disaster. Don't you dare go hit up NOAA. Received today at 1:05 a.m.
Well, Neil, Myron, both of you, how do you respond to something like that?
Look, Cal and Neil, I'm sure you've received similar phone calls and messages and emails and letters. I've gotten, death threats over the years from people who sounded somewhat more dangerous than David Legates' caller. But look, the hysteria created by the climate establishment, I don't know what to call them exactly, the hacks and thugs that get out on the media and tell us that the world is about to end and everybody who disagrees with that is evil. These people have fomented a huge amount of fear and hatred. And this is what is the result of the disgraceful actions by people in the climate establishment and the mainstream media. There's no way, these people should be ashamed of themselves to create the sort of psychological disturbance that you heard on that telephone message. And so, look, I think that the advice that David should own a gun, I assume he already does, and I think it's good advice.
He does have a constitutional right to it.
Right.
Neil,
let me make a
comment
comment on that, Cal. This lady is a classic example of how uninformed the public is about global warming. Why do the public have opinion? Because that's what they're fed day after day after day after day from mainstream media. And the mainstream media has demonized all the people who would call themselves skeptics. And the skeptics are the ones that are looking at the data. The people in the alarmist community are the ones that haven't looked at the data. But this is just classic of how people are uninformed. I give a lot of talks, and my audience would be like Rotary Club, Kiwanis Club, Lions Club, marinas, and things like that. And I often ask people, why do you have your opinion about global warming? Well, that's what we're being told. That's absolutely right. That's what they're being told. And that those of us that are in the community, like David, are trying to get the science out so that people will be better informed. And the problem is that the media has already been tied up by the alarmists, and it's very difficult to get the message out to the public.
Yeah.
Neil, Cal, could I just add to that? Neil, I agree with that, but I think it needs to be said that the mainstream media may have their own motives and interests in promoting this climate hysteria, but ultimately it's the climate establishment scientists that are responsible for this. If
That's right.
some of them, if one of these thugs would say, "Hey, wait a minute, this is just over the top. I can't. This is going way too far." Now, Judy Curry, whom you mentioned earlier, is an interesting example because she's someone who was mugged. She's a climate realist, but she looks at the evidence, and she was mugged by these people, and she said, "Hey, wait a minute, there's something wrong going on here when science is put in the service of a political agenda, and we have to all toe the line and just say yes, sir, whenever we're told what to think." So I really think the scientists are ultimately responsible and not the mainstream media.
Yeah, and I would
Well,
just for safety's sake remind us of this.
The problem is that the alarmists have
ahead,
gained the control of the mainstream media.
Well,
how
yes,
do you
that's right.
how do you
Yeah, sure.
break that?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. I would add though that I've heard people who would say that they are with us, okay, sympathetic to our thinking. I've heard them um, say things that are equally um, straw man caricatures of the other side as what this woman said. And I think it's really important that we, among climate realists, correct those who just say, for example, "Oh, the whole thing is nothing but a hoax. Carbon dioxide has nothing to do with climate. Human activity doesn't do anything at all about climate change." When that kind of thing comes out, that robs the real climate skeptic scientists of credibility, because people hear that and they say, "Oh, well, that's what you think too." So we need to be just as proactive in correcting the people who are critics of the alarmists and yet who are themselves erring in the opposite direction. Well, on to the next point here. Either one of you can respond to this one. Maybe you both will. E&E News's Climate Wire newsletter wrote that Dr. Legates, quote, has claimed that addressing climate change would do more harm than good. And he has said pumping more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere would benefit humanity, unquote. Now, that's quite contrary to the typical message about climate change. Why would Dr. Legates say that?
Neil, do you want to go first, or do you want me to?
Well, I'd be happy to go first about that. One of the videos that I watched, and I think this came from the Heartland Institute, is that he has an excellent video out on the benefits of carbon dioxide in terms of the plant world. And there's been no question about it. Nurseries that control their environment pump the carbon dioxide levels up to 1,200 parts per million. Why? Because they get better growth and it requires less moisture. The current levels are around 400. Well, people that are involved in the plant world know that. And it was very interesting to take a look at David's video as he explained this. And that is absolutely true. There is a tremendous benefit from carbon dioxide in the plant world that is not well understood by the public. As a matter of fact, the first reaction I get in the public is carbon dioxide is a pollutant.
And it's
well
not.
said, Neil.
Go ahead,
I
Myron.
would just add, yeah, I would just add to that. That was very well said, Neil. Look, climate change is a mixed bag, and higher CO2 levels in the atmosphere are a mixed bag. There are benefits and there are negatives, and it depends on where you are and how you feel about things and which part of the world is affected negatively or positively by climate change. But the one thing that the climate establishment has never admitted, and you said everybody knows this, but they have never admitted that carbon dioxide is a naturally occurring, harmless gas that is necessary for life on Earth. Without it, plants couldn't photosynthesize, and if plants can't photosynthesize, they die, and we don't have anything to eat. So this is increasing levels of carbon dioxide. It's very clear from NASA's satellite photography higher CO2 levels are increasing the greening of the earth. Now, aesthetically, I'm kind of a rural intermountain westerner. I kind of like the dry look. But if you believe in more food production and more biodiversity, higher CO2 levels are good. That's the plus side of burning coal, oil, and natural gas. As far as the policies, though, David Legates has offered an opinion. It's not a scientific opinion. It's his opinion as a citizen that the policies being proposed to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and save us from this supposedly catastrophic global warming are more harmful and more expensive and more damaging than global warming itself. As a policy person, I absolutely agree with him, but that's not a scientific question. That's a policy question, and it's a question of how the economics turn out. Joe Biden says that we're going to create zillions of jobs from green jobs by getting rid of coal, oil, and natural gas and going to renewable energy, and I disagree. And I think President Trump disagrees. So that's where the debate is, and that's why President Trump has appointed David Legates to an important scientific position and not one of the Obama-Biden administration's scientists.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think, by the way,
Cal,
I think we could create zillions of jobs.
Ryan. I've got an interesting question. What are the optimum levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere?
Right. And Neil, what is the ideal temperature?
That's right.
I like. Have we found what the ideal temperature is? Was it 1900 or 2000 or 1850 or 1200 AD?
Yeah, that's
well,
one
I
of
know
those questions
that in the last
simply is
10,000
not an
years,
answer.
our carbon dioxide levels have been just above this minimum level. If it ever drops below 150, all plant life dies. We've been in the mid 250s for 10,000 years. That's just above the alarmist level. So what is the optimum level? It's got to be more than what we're experiencing today.
Absolutely.
One point quickly about creating jobs. You mentioned, Myron, that Biden says that his program would create a whole lot of jobs. I have a program to create zillions of jobs. We get rid of all internal combustion and electric engines, because electrical engines for cars and trucks and so on, they have to get their electricity from the grid. You got to do something. You got to generate that electricity somehow. All of those things create waste. So instead, what we do is we harness 500 people to a semi trailer, and they tow it across the country. And there you go. You've got 500 jobs right there. Why not?
Yeah, no, Cal, we could create at least 100 million new jobs by getting rid of mechanized agriculture, which is dependent upon petroleum, right? Without oil to run those tractors, those diesel tractors and those gasoline tractors, we would all have to go back to. I come from a ranching family, and I know what the difference is between doing the work yourself and having a machine to do it. And if we could create 100 million new jobs tomorrow by getting rid of tractors and combines and so on.
And we just lose most of the other things that we take for granted every day, as well as not having as much food produced. Well, Neil, as a climate scientist, you recognize that for all practical purposes, all the energy entering into Earth's climate system comes from the sun. A tiny, tiny fraction comes from nuclear decay and cooling of the Earth's core, but neither of those is sufficient to have any detectable effect on global average temperature. Now, NPR complained that Dr. Legates, quote, appeared in a video pushing the discredited theory. I'm always curious as to just who does the discrediting, that the sun is the cause of global warming, unquote. Now, aside from the fact that Legates's published writings have explicitly affirmed that changes in atmospheric CO2 content almost certainly have contributed to climate change, so he wouldn't say that the sun is the cause of global warming. so NPR misrepresents him. No surprise there, by the way. Is there any legitimacy to the idea that the sun could have contributed to the global warming observed over the last few hundred years, or particularly about the last 60 years?
Well, there's multitudes of scientists in Asia, particularly in China, that believe the sun is very important in terms of our weather patterns. And the people that are sun experts believe that the sun is turning very quiet. Now, you can measure the kind of the intensity of the sun by measuring the sunspots and keep track of those. Well, during the 90s, there was there were a lot of sunspots, and that's when we observed the warming. And now what's happening is the sun is turning very quiet. As a matter of fact, the number of sunspots were back when we were in the little ice age in the 1700s. So there are multitudes of experts who believe that the sun plays a very important role in the Earth's weather. And I agree with you. It's only one of a multitude of factors that control the weather.
All right. Well, Myron Ebell, Neil Frank, thank you very much, both of you, so much for joining us on the program. I'd like to give each of you a chance to make just a quick closing remark, whatever you'd like to say. Myron?
Thank you, Cal. First of all, David Legates is a really good guy, and he's a good scientist, and you should be very proud of the fact that he's an advisor to the Cornwall Alliance. As I said earlier, I really admire the work that you do, and it's a privilege for me and an honor to be able to coordinate and cooperate with you on things. I'm here at CEI in the political muck here in Washington, D.C., so I don't get to do the highfalutin stuff that you do, but we're working to make to expose the junk science behind the climate science hysteria, and we're working for a world where more energy is a good thing, not a bad thing. So we oppose energy rationing policies at CEI, and we work for abundant, affordable energy. And I think that's so important for people around the world. And you at the Cornwall Alliance have done so much to make that argument and show why it's the critical argument facing the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Myron, very much. Not just for coming on tonight's program, but also for all that you and the Competitive Enterprise Institute do to further the causes of sound science, of freedom, and of the conquest of poverty through private property rights, entrepreneurship, free trade, limited government, and the rule of law. All of those deep concerns of the Cornwall Alliance as well. Thanks again.
Thank you, Cal.
Neil, you're welcome. Neil,
well, I am just delighted.
Thank you for joining us second time.
Yeah.
Your closing comment?
I am delighted that David is in this role within NOAA. Now, whether he will be able to have a big influence, that's yet debatable. But, Dr. Happer certainly had an influence within this administration for the period of time that he was there in Washington. And now I hope that David has that same influence within NOAA. He is a very solid scientist, a person that we need to respect, and a person that I respect, and I am just delighted that he's been appointed to this position.
Great. Well, thanks very, very much.
Amen.
Neil Frank, Myron Ebell, thanks again for coming on the show. Folks, remember that throughout the month of September, as our way of saying thank you for your 100% tax-deductible donation of literally any size to the Cornwall Alliance, we will send you a copy of the documentary video, It's Easy Being Green When You Have No Choice, Sustainable Development and the End of History. All you need to do is go to cornwallalliance.org, click on the donate button, make your donation of any size, and in the comments field, type in promo code 2009 or just ask for It's Easy Being Green. Looking forward to seeing you again next week on From the Stacks. Thanks so much for joining us tonight. Okay.